Sup y'all, and welcome to the Great Divergence, Unit 3, Part 3. And in this video today, we're going to look at how Europe descended into chaos during the Wild Wild West. The world today is made up of more than 200 individual states, and they are all at least in some way based on the European nation-state model. So the question we'll look at now is, how did Europe transcend into a system of independent states? In 1517, Martin Luther tacked 95 theses to the front door of the Wittenberg Church, criticizing certain practices, such as the selling of indulgences by priests such as Johann Tetzel. With the power of the printing press, Luther's words diffused outside the Holy Roman Empire and gained traction throughout Europe. As rebellions began to erupt in 1521, Emperor Charles V called upon Luther to repudiate his views at the Diet of Worms. Luther was denounced as a heretic and was banished, but he found an ally in one of the German princes and hid in Saxony. It was there that he and others translated and printed the Bible into German from originally in Latin. Concurrently, many German nobles supported the Protestant Reformation, seeing an opportunity to seize land and power at the expense of the Church. By the mid-1500s, violence erupted in a Catholic-led peasant revolt, mostly against German Protestant nobles. Luther, however, did not support this and even condemned the growing violence. In this drawing, you see one of the leaders of the peasant revolt being burned alive at the stake. Now, Protestantism spread beyond the borders of the Holy Roman Empire. Around the same time, but almost independently of Martin Luther, Huldrych Zwingli of Switzerland spread the Reformation and rejected anything not literally stated in the Bible. John Calvin, also of Switzerland, was initially a strong follower of Lutheranism, but in 1533, he concluded that faith was a gift from God. This is the notion of predestination, that God saved only the elect. And if you see in this map, you can see in blue where Calvinism was spreading throughout Europe. In England, Henry VIII was a devout Catholic who was given the title of Defender of the Faith by the Vatican Pope. However, in the late 1520s, he wanted an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Although she gave birth to 6 children, only one daughter, Mary, survived. He wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, one of his wife's attendants, but the Pope failed to make any decision. In 1533, Anne Boleyn was pregnant, and Henry VIII married her. Unfortunately for Henry, she gave birth to a girl, Elizabeth. In 1534, Henry formed the Anglican Church with the king as the supreme head of the Church of England. He then proceeded to seize Catholic lands and granted them to nobles. It would seem that bribery would get him everywhere. Now, the Catholic Church was losing thousands of followers to Protestantism, resulting in less money and power. They had to do something to stop the bleeding, so enter the Counterreformation. The Council of Trent met on and off from 1545 to 1563 to unify Catholic dogma. The Church did eventually abolish the sale of indulgences, but they held on to many of their core beliefs, such as salvation is the result of faith and works, and they also reasserted the authority of the Church in addition to the Bible. Through the Inquisitions, the Church set up tribunals that would investigate, arrest, and prosecute heretics. They fined, imprisoned, tortured, or even executed some of those who didn't follow their ways. In 1534, Ignatius de Loyola founded the Jesuits, who combined Renaissance humanism with Catholic ideals. They led an anti-Protestant campaign, stressing good deeds and spreading Catholicism, while creating a network of schools and universities across the globe. While Jesuits and other Catholics helped stem the Protestant tide, the power of the Church had been greatly diminished, which paved the way for monarchies to become the most powerful entities in Europe, who over time sought to create strong nation-states. Now, Charles V of the Habsburgs inherited one of the most vast empires in European history. Over time, he grew exhausted and split his lands before retreating to a monastery. Nonetheless, Europe was still a violent place. Now, Philip II inherited the Spanish Habsburgs in the mid-1500s. He was strongly Catholic and had previously married the equally devout Catholic Mary I of England, known as Bloody Mary, since she had over 200 people burned at the stake for primarily religious reasons. Then, in 1558, she died, which led to her Anglican sister Elizabeth I to become queen. Now, Spain was the mightiest country in the world at that time, due to American gold and silver primarily. And due to high taxes and religious intolerance, a Dutch revolt broke out in 1568, where the Calvinists were eventually supported by Elizabeth I. In 1588, Philip II, fed up with England's interference, set out the Spanish Armada, 151 ships loaded with troops. The English, though outnumbered, had more maneuverable ships and routed the Spanish, forcing them to retreat around England. It was on the return to Spain that they encountered a storm that battered and sank around half of the Armada. This was later referred to as the Protestant wind, since of course England was Anglican and the Spanish were there as a Catholic crusade. In the mid to late 1500s, violence spread throughout France, leading to revolts and even all-out war. On one side were the Catholics, who were the majority. And you can see those there with the green is on the map. On the other side were the Huguenots, who were Calvinists or French Protestants. And you can see in the map in the purple where the Huguenots actually had more of a majority. And of course in the yellow where there was in between. Now, Henry IV of the Bourbon dynasty was raised a Huguenot, but upon inheriting the throne, he converted to Catholicism. He stated, "Paris is worth a mass." In 1598, Henry IV passed the Edict of Nantes, which granted freedom of religion to the Huguenots and granted them full civil rights. Now, this act granting freedom of religion was unheard of at that time in Europe. Unfortunately for him, in 1610, he was stabbed to death by a fanatical Catholic while his coach was stopped in traffic. Now, to look at the 30 Years' War, it clearly had its roots in the wars of religion. In 1618, 2 Catholic emissaries were thrown from a high window at a meeting hall. This is known as the defenestration of Prague. Now, defenestration is the act of throwing somebody out of a window. Add that to your vocabulary. In fact, I encourage you to use it at least once a day. Now, this incident started a war between the Protestants and the Catholics in the Holy Roman Empire, but eventually pitted the great European powers of that time. In order to maintain a balance of power in Europe, Sweden, and later France, intervened on behalf of the Protestants. The reason for this had to do with, you guessed it, geography. Now, France, for example, entered for self-preservation. It was located between the 2 major Habsburg lands and sought to keep them separated, even though France was largely Catholic. During the 30 Years' War, violence and pestilence ravaged the Holy Roman Empire, and the surrounding lands as well. Anywhere between 25 to 40% of the German population died. Plague, typhoid fever, and even a syphilis pandemic broke out in Europe. Syphilis, which originated in the Americas, spread like wildfire during some years, leading to things like sores, rashes, blindness, insanity, as you see here, and even death in many cases. Spurred by pandemics, war, and religious fanaticism, witch hunts also occurred. Most victims were poor, single, or widowed women. Through the Reformation and increased materialism, which of course led to more wealth, secularism, which is the diminished role of religion, became much more prevalent during this time period. After 30 years of brutal warfare in the Holy Roman Empire and 80 years of fighting between the Spanish and the Dutch, a series of treaties known as the Peace of Westphalia were signed in 1648. This modern notion of Westphalian sovereignty, which exists today, can be split into 3 main parts. The first is that each state would be sovereign over its own territory and have the right to self-determination. This is called territoriality. A second one is that each state would be legally equal in power to any other state, regardless of its size. And a third is that states would not interfere with the internal affairs of other states, and this is the principle of non-intervention. Also, as a result of the Peace of Westphalia, many new country borders were established. And finally, in the Holy Roman Empire, each prince would have the right to determine the religion of his own state, the options being Catholicism, Lutheranism, or Calvinism. And if one's religion was not the established church, he was guaranteed the freedom of worship, or basically the right to practice his faith. To sum up and briefly explain how Europe transcended into a system of independent states, the Protestant Reformation led to a series of revolts, rebellions, and revolutions in the early 16th century. Europe was thrust into an era plagued by wars of religion between rival states such as Spain and England. But fighting also erupted within states such as France. The violence spread throughout the continent and culminated into the destructive 30 Years' War, mostly fought within the Holy Roman Empire. Finally, the Peace of Westphalia not only ended the conflict, but became the origin of the modern state, the core component of today's international relations and laws. The Westphalian system guarantees the sovereignty of one's borders, as well as the absence of foreign intervention with regard to national concerns.
That is correct.